We've been making our way through the Old Testament. It's hard to believe we're almost through the first 5 books of the Bible. We're in the 22nd chapter of the book of Deuteronomy. If we started in the book of Genesis on a Sunday morning, and then we jumped over and we had a Wednesday night where we began going chapter by chapter, and we're now all the way to Genesis chapter 22. I mean, what did I say? I said Deuteronomy chapter 22, the 5th book. And then we'll be starting the book of Joshua, which an incredible, as the children of Israel go into the promised land. Man, one of my favorite books, the book of Joshua. And so we're going to be there just in a few short weeks. We'll be moving through the book of Deuteronomy. I think we're about 12 chapters out, 10 after tonight, I believe. And then we'll be finishing up the book of Deuteronomy and then starting the book of Joshua. Chapter 22, Deuteronomy. And I think it's important just to kind of remind us what's happening. Moses is about to pass the torch to Joshua. Moses is going to die. He never sees the promised land. Because he misrepresented God, God didn't allow him to enter into the promised land. And it's amazing because as Moses is instructing, it's a whole new generation. Moses had already given the law to the prior generation, but they wouldn't obey God. And because of their lack of faith and obedience, God didn't allow them to enter the promised land either. And for 40 years, they wandered in the desert. And now Moses at the end of his life, and he's going to pass on to the next generation what God had already told the previous generation. And it's not really, what's incredible about the book of Deuteronomy is it's not really repetitive because he's putting the application to what he had already established in Leviticus and Numbers. And it's incredible because God is giving the children of Israel instruction on how to be blessed in this new land that we're going to be living in. And God's going to lay out for them the moral laws and the ceremonial laws. He's going to tell them what right is and what wrong is. And guys, and here, as we're going through this, some of this stuff's a little difficult because of our culture. Because you read it and you go, wait a second, that don't sound right. Because this is totally opposite of what we've been drenched in. But remember this, God's the one who created everything. He's the king. He's the one who has the right to tell us what right and wrong is. He's the one who has the authority to establish what right and wrong is. And so he's going to lay out for them what he desires for the nation that's going to be guided by him. You see, the Israel was going to be a theocracy. A theocracy, let me give you the definition for a theocracy. It's a government of a state by immediate divine guidance or by officials who are regarded as divinely guided. And this is what is this government that's going to be established as they go into the promised land was going to be guided by God. The priests and the Levites and all of those that were going to be doing the spiritual activities inside this promised land, we're going to give them the responsibility of carrying out what God had established. But it wasn't their idea, it was God's idea. It wasn't their law, it was God's law. And so this was going to be a theocracy. They were going to be governed by God. God was going to be the one who was going to guide them. Now, down the road, by the time we get to the book of Judges, they had abandoned God's law. And here's what God says concerning them in Judges chapter 17. Watch what it says in the 6th verse. It says this: in those days there was no king in Israel, and everyone did what was right in his own eyes. You see, in our culture, that would have been celebrated. Everyone's doing what's right in their own eyes. Yeah. In that time, it was saying that was something that was totally in opposition, because we're not supposed to do what's right in our own eyes. We're supposed to do what's right in God's eyes. That's what God was desiring for the nation. There's a proverb. Proverbs 12:15 says this: "The way of a fool is right in his own eyes, but he who heeds counsel is wise." A fool does what's right in his own eyes. He just does whatever he feels rather than seeking counsel, and that counsel comes from God. And God's given him the counsel. Proverbs 21:2 says this: "Every way of a man is right in his own eyes, but the Lord weighs the hearts." You see, we can make up our own rules and go, "Oh, that's right. Why? Because I said so." But that doesn't fly with God. That's not what God says is right. And so God is going to establish for them what's right. Now, as we get into chapter 22, notice what happens. Verse 1 of chapter 22. "You shall not see your brother's ox or his sheep going astray and hide yourself from them. You shall certainly bring them back to your brother. If your brother is not near you, or you do not know him, then you shall bring it to your own house, and it shall remain with you until your brother seeks it. Then you shall restore it to him. You shall do the same with his donkey, and so you shall do with his garments. With any lost thing of your brother's which he has lost and you have found, you shall do likewise. You must not hide yourself. You shall not see your brother's donkey or his ox fall down along the road and hide yourself from him. You shall surely help him lift them up again." So God is, again, when the law says, look, you're not just concerned about your own interest. You're also to be concerned about the interest of others. You see your brother's ox walking down the street, you're like, tough luck. Now, why would God have to tell us these things? Because he knows us, right? It's so much easier to see someone else having, some issue or some problem and just to look the other way and pretend like you didn't see it. You put that in today's language. You see someone on the side of the road with a flat tire. And you just kind of like, oh, I don't know if I really want to waste my time or take my effort. You see, there was this law that God was establishing that we're to care about other people's things and other people's circumstances. And that's what a community was going to be established. You can only have a community if you're not just thinking about yourself, but you're thinking about others. And so God says, whenever you see your brother's donkey, like, I know that there goes that donkey again. That dumb donkey gets out every week. I'm not going to bother. He goes, no, you're to take it back to him. And if you don't know whose it is, and you take care of it until they come looking for it, and then you give it back to them. And that's true of their garment as well. Now, we have a lost and found. If you lost a jacket, we're saving it for you. Just so you know. Because there is a responsibility we have to care for one another. And God is establishing that was going to be not just for your immediate family. He's not talking about just your brother. He's talking about your brother, anyone who's living around you or amongst you. And so he's laying out for them the concern that they were to have for one another. Look at verse 5. "A woman shall not wear anything that pertains to a man, nor shall a man put on woman's garments, for all who do so are an abomination to the Lord your God." Now God's establishing this identity, this gender, that a man was to wear men's clothes, a woman was to wear men's clothes. Now, this isn't saying that women can't wear Levi's, because there's some who interpret it that way. Look, Levi's are men's clothes, you can't wear Levi's. That's not what he's saying here. He's talking about, and what was happening in their temples of the pagan gods that they would serve, much like today, there was cross-dressing and transvestites, and there was all this madness going on. And God's saying, for you as my people, that's not going to be among you. There's not going to be no blurring of lines when it comes to who a man is and who a woman is. And God's the one who created them. And how did he create them? Male and female. There wasn't a confusion when it came to gender. And right now, we're in a very confusing place in our culture right now. It's causing a lot of confusion amongst our young people right now. They don't even know, they're growing up not knowing what they're supposed to be. Right? And God tells them very clearly, look, now, think about it. They're wearing robes back in that day. Now, if I saw someone in a robe, I'd say, that's girl clothes. So, and the women would wear robes, the men would wear robes, the men would wear earrings. He's not saying that the actual, now there's some things that guys are wearing that I go, why would you want to wear skinny jeans? Just doesn't compute with me. I don't even know how you function. If that's what being cool is, I don't want to be cool. But what God is saying is, look, let's not blur the lines when it comes to the gender thing, and that's what He's telling the children of Israel. You can go into my land. Here's what I'm laying out for you. That we're not gonna confuse men and women and try to figure out who's who. It's an abomination to the Lord. Look at verse 6. If a bird's nest happens to be before you along the way in any tree or in any ground with young ones or eggs, with the mother sitting on the young or in the eggs, you shall not take the mother with the young. You shall surely let the mother go, take the young for yourself, and that it may be well with you, that you may prolong your days. Now, there's some amount of care for the animal kingdom that God is establishing. And what's interesting in this passage is He's saying, look, you're more than free to take the eggs. You're more than free to even take the chicks. But you're not going to destroy life and the ability for the kingdom to reproduce. And so He says, have out all the eggs you want. Hard-boiled eggs are good. And you can, eggs for breakfast isn't a bad thing. But you're not going to, go and mess up the environmental design that God had created by taking mom too, so that, she's able to go and continue to reproduce. And so God's concerned about those things. God cares about the animal kingdom. He cares, and think about this: man was dependent upon the animal kingdom in order for his own survival. And so God's really saying you be wise to not destroy what's going to create. And so He's wanting them to continue to multiply. Now, watch this. Again, just so much of our laws, guys, in our own culture, based upon biblical foundations. And look at this next one. This is good. Look what He tells us there in verse 8. When you build a new house, you shall make a parapet for your roof, that you may not bring guilt of bloodshed on your household if anyone falls from it. Now, if you're going to go and build a new house, He says, look, you're going to be held responsible if someone, you do something negligent and it's a hazard and someone else is going to hurt themselves in the process. So if you're going to, and much of Israel, even to this day, you go to Israel, they have, their clothes on the roof. They have much of their lounging up on the roof, and when in the evening when it's cold, people are sitting on the roof. They have flat roofs, and it was required that on that flat roof that you put a parapet wall, so someone, the kids are playing and everyone's running around over there, and someone doesn't just accidentally fall off the roof. And you would be held accountable for it. There's some negligent laws that, are in our country based upon these principles. So if you're going to build something, you got to make sure that it's safe. And so God is telling them, look, there's safety here that has to be considered when you're doing these things. And then look what he says in verse 9. Here's an interesting one. We're going to read 9 to 12 together. That's what he says. You shall not sow your vineyard with different kinds of seed, lest the yield of the seed which you have sown and the fruit of your vineyard be defiled. You shall not plow with an ox and a donkey together. And you shall not wear a garment of different sorts, such as wool and linen mixed together. Now you read that passage and go, what in the world is that all about? You're not supposed to mix seeds. You're not supposed to put a donkey and an ox to plow together, unequally yoked together, because a donkey isn't going to be able to carry the weight of an ox. The ox going to have to do double the work, and they don't kind of stride together. And so he's saying, look, this isn't going to work when you do that. When you put the seeds together, that's not going to work. And then a garment of wool and linen mixed together. Now, what God is establishing is that there are laws of separation that God's establishing that might not make sense to anybody else, but because God decreed it and God declared it, that they were to abide by it. And I think there was a principle behind this whole thing, that they were to be a nation that was separate from all the other nations of the world. They weren't to intermingle with other nations. Not because God was talking about the different race. He was talking about the different gods. Gentiles can come into the kingdom as long as they were serving the same God. And what God is wanting them to understand is that there are certain things that God's going to tell you to separate. That might not make sense in your natural mind, but God has a purpose behind it. You see, when we get to the book of 2 Corinthians in the 6th chapter, he's going to tell us, do not be unequally yoked together with unbelievers. Why? For what fellowship has righteousness with lawlessness? You see, someone who's walking with the Lord, and then you go and yoke yourself to someone who's not walking with the Lord, what's going to happen? It's like yoking a donkey and an ox together. They're kind of pulling different directions. They're kind of heading different ways. And so if you have someone who's a believer and you're wanting to follow the Lord and you go yoke yourself to someone that's not a believer, it's going to cause great conflict in your relationship down the road. Because you're going to want to raise your kids to know God. And then the person you married who doesn't love the Lord, they're going to have no desire to walk with the Lord. And your kids are going to grow up confused. Well, Dad don't go to church. I mean, why do I have to go to church? Dad don't serve the Lord. Why do I have to serve the Lord? And now you got a war inside your own house, rather than you guys walking the same direction together. He would go on in that same passage there in 2 Corinthians chapter 6, and he says, what communion has light with darkness? Light and darkness can't be in the same room. Once you turn the light on, the darkness flees. And that's the same case with someone who's trying to walk with the Lord and someone who has no desire to do that. You're like oil and water. And so he's wanting them to understand that, there's certain things that God establishes that are to be separate. Now, I don't think, man, I better go home and check all my clothes and make sure I don't have linen and wool. And, that's not the intent here. Just like he's not, telling, women not to wear Levi's. Right? That's not the intent here, but there is a principle behind those things. And so he lays out for us there. Now, look at verse 12. You shall make tassels on the four corners of the clothing with which you cover yourself. Now, the children of Israel, even to this day, you go to Israel, and And the religious Jews still put the tassels on their clothes because of this particular passage. And it was to remind them that they were different than everybody else. It was to remind them that God had given them a law that they were to abide by. And the tassel was there as a reminder. You know what? We're different. We're different than the rest of the world because we have God as our King. Guys, Christian, understand something, Christian? You're different than the rest of the world. You're not like the world. God's given you His Spirit living inside of you. And God's desire is to guide you and direct you. He wants to govern your life. He wants a theocracy to be taking place between you and Him. And that's not true of the rest of the world. That's only true of those who have surrendered their life to Him. And that's the idea of Christianity, man. I'm Christ-like. I'm following Him. And so He lays out for them this important principles. He says, look, there's going to be identifying marks in your life and even in your clothing as He tells them to put these tassels there. Now, verse 13, watch this. If any man takes a wife and goes into her and he detests her and charges her with shameful conduct and brings a bad name on her and says, I took this woman and when I came to her I found that she was not a virgin. And the father and mother of the young woman shall take and bring out the evidence of the young woman's virginity to the elders of the city and the gate. And the young woman's father shall say to the elders, I gave my daughter to this man as a wife and he detests her. And he has charged her with a shameful conduct, saying, I found your daughter was not a virgin, and yet these are the evidence of my daughter's virginity, and they shall spread the cloth before the elders of the city, and the elders of the city shall take that man and punish him, and they shall fine him 100 shekels of silver and give them to the father of the young woman, because he has brought a bad name on a virgin of Israel, and he shall be his wife. He cannot divorce her all of his days. Now, think about what's going on here. Jesus is laying out what? The moral law. He's taking this idea of sexual relationship and saying this is to be something that's set apart between a husband and a wife. He wants purity within his people. And so he said there was the law that was saying, look, if you marry a woman and she claims to be a virgin, she's claiming her virginity, and a man takes her and then he finds out, you know what, she wasn't a virgin when I married her. She lied to me. The mom and dad of that young girl were to take the sheet that they had their first relationship on, and they were to save it in case he ever made that claim. Now, I know this is way weird for our culture. You're just going, whoa, that's crazy. Remember, God's establishing His culture inside of Israel, and purity was to be part of it. Now, I get we're in a whole different world right now, guys. But I think the idea here is that God is looking to establish moral fiber into the society that He's going to govern. And if a man went and he claimed that she wasn't a virgin, and yet the mom and dad had proof that she was a virgin, they would come back and say, look, he lied. We got proof. He would take it to the elders. Now, and if they caught him lying, the elders realized, he's just trying to get out of this marriage. He had second thoughts after getting married, and he's trying to look for an excuse, to get rid of this chick. Here's what we're going to do. Watch this. Verse 18. The elders of that city shall take that man and punish him. They shall fine him 100 shekels of silver, give them to the father of the young woman, because he has brought a bad name on the virgin of Israel, and he shall be his wife. He cannot divorce her all of his days. This guy was going to get worked. They're going to pay, then they're going to beat him. And then he's got to go back to that same woman. he's going to be, with his tail between his legs. Because he tried to get out of a responsibility and a covenant that he had made between him and this woman and between him and God. And he says, look, now you're responsible to care for it. Now, and I feel bad for the woman. She's stuck with him now. He's a creep. Right? And she's got to like, what do I do now? I got this creep as a husband. Now, verse 21. And they shall bring out the young woman to the door of the father's house, and the men of her city shall. Oh, no, I missed the whole verse. Verse 20. But if the thing is true, if the evidence of virginity is not found for the young woman, then they shall bring out the young woman to the door of her father's house, and the men of her city shall stone her to death with stones, because she has done a disgraceful thing in Israel to play the harlot in her father's house. So you shall put away the evil from among you. Wow, that was the death penalty. You see, here's the deal, guys. God is looking for the family structure to be strengthened. He's looking for a commitment to be, anytime sexual activity was taking place, it wasn't just something you did as a recreation or you just did it haphazardly. There had to be a commitment before that was taking place. And so God was looking to establish marriage and the family unit as the centerpiece of this new nation. And the only way that happens is if there's commitment and there's purity within the nation. And so he's laying out some heavy stuff. Now, watch this. Look at the next one. If a man is found lying with a woman who's married to a husband, verse 22, then both of them shall die, the man that lay with the woman and the woman, so you shall put away evil from Israel. Now, if someone's caught in adultery, both parties were to be stoned. Okay, now I want to put this in perspective because I know we're just going, wow, there'd be a lot of dead people right now. Desperate housewives, I mean, it wouldn't even exist. It would be. Jesus. Turn to John chapter 7. I think it's important to cover this. Turn to John chapter 7. Beginning in verse 2. The Gospel of John chapter 7. Look at verse 2. Now early in the morning, Jesus came again into the temple, and all the people came to him, and he sat down and he taught them. And the scribes and the Pharisees brought to him a woman caught in adultery. And when they had set her in the midst, they said to him, Teacher, this woman was caught in adultery in the very act. So Moses in the law commanded us that she should be stoned. What do you say? Now, it's interesting. Somehow these Pharisees walked up and they found an adulterous affair. I mean, that's just weird to me. Right? In the first place. I mean, either this was a setup or these guys, some weird's going on. But then what's even weirder is that they only brought the woman. Remember, the law said the man and the woman are to die. But they just dragged the woman over there. And they threw her before Jesus, and he says, look, the law says she should die. And she should be stoned right here and right now. What are you going to say, Jesus? Because they're looking to put Jesus on the spot. And then Jesus, I love Jesus. Look what he does. And they said this, testing him, that he might have something to accuse him, verse 6. But Jesus stooped down and he wrote on the ground with his finger, as though he did not hear. And they continued asking him. And he raised himself up and he said to them, He who is without sin among you, let him throw a stone at her first. And he stooped, and again he stooped down and wrote on the ground, and those who heard it, being convicted by their conscience, went one by one, beginning with the eldest even to the last. And Jesus was left alone, and the woman standing in the midst. I love it. Jesus kind of bends down to the ground. And he starts writing. And, it doesn't tell us what he was writing, but from the eldest down to the youngest, they just start walking away. And I'm convinced Jesus was sitting down writing, Sue. And the first one goes, "Who, Sue?" He went running. And he starts writing their sin right on the ground. And one by one, Jesus knows every one of them and exactly what they're guilty of, and he just writes it, and pretty soon there was no one left. And there's this woman caught in adultery just lying there at the feet of Jesus. And Jesus turns to the woman and he said, "Woman, where are your accusers? Has no one condemned you?" And she said, "No one, Lord." And Jesus said to her, "Neither do I condemn you. Go and sin no more." Wow. Isn't that cool? You see, even though the law had demanded that this woman be stoned, Jesus showed grace and mercy to this woman. And not only did he demonstrate grace and mercy, he wasn't being light on sin. That wasn't the heart of Jesus. He wasn't just saying, "Oh, it doesn't matter, just go ahead and keep committing adultery." Jesus says, "You know what? You've been forgiven. But don't continue to do those things that are unlawful or wrong in the eyes of God. Go and sin no more." Because that's the grace of God. We're looking at the law. We're looking at the Old Testament here. There's principles behind here that I think are very important for us as Christians to understand. But understand this, we're not living under law today. We're living under grace. And when you understand the grace of God, it should cause you with a greater desire to be obedient to him, more so than any law could ever accomplish. It should want you to live a holy life, more so than any regulation that you and I can bring ourselves under. Because we understand that we have a God who loves us. And his desire is for us to walk under his rule and under his authority. That's why he came and died on the cross for you. Is so that he can rule you and he can guide you and he can direct you because he loves you. And so when this very law was being brought up to Jesus, Jesus undermined it all by saying, "Look, if you're the one without sin, then you cast the first stone." And every one of their sin, man, just laid out there. And I'm convinced, it was like, oh man, Jesus knows everything. And so he lays it out for them. Now look at verse 23, back in Deuteronomy. If a young woman who is a virgin is betrothed to a husband. Now remember what betrothal was. Betrothal was an engagement. And they considered an engagement just as binding as a marriage covenant. And so he says, if a young woman is a virgin betrothed to a husband and a man finds her in the city and he lies with her, then you shall bring them both out to the gate of that city and you shall stone them to death with stones, the young woman because she did not cry out in the city, and the man because he humbled his neighbor's wife. So you shall put away the evil from among you. Now she's engaged. They're in the city limits. Now if you're in the city limits, and in that time, if a woman was being attacked, she would scream and the men would actually respond. There was chivalry. There was this desire to protect the weaker. And if a woman was in the city limits and she screams, there would have been 10 guys there in a second. And so what the law is saying, if she didn't scream, is she was willing rather than resisting. And so she's just as guilty as the man. Because and a woman could just go, well, he forced me, I'm sorry. He's like, no, it's not going to fly. If she's in the city and she screamed, you need to resist. And let me tell you, girls, if someone's pushing themselves on you, bite them. Pluck their eyes out. Scream. Right? I mean, that's what is expected. And you're watching all of this craziness in Hollywood right now. And you wonder how much of it is really going along with, we're living in different times, right? But think about this. He's saying, look, if this is going on, you should be screaming your lungs out. And then in that culture, they would have come running to your assistance to help you, and it was expected. But look at this. This is heavy. Watch this. But, verse 25, if a man finds a betrothed young woman in the countryside and the man forces her and lies with her, then only the man who lay with her shall die. You shall do nothing to the young woman. There is in the young woman no sin deserving of death, for just as when a man rises against his neighbor and kills him, even so in this matter. For he found her in the countryside, and the betrothed young woman cried out, but there was no one to save her. And if a man finds a young woman who is a virgin, who is not betrothed, and he seizes her and he lies with her, and they are found out, then the man who lay with her shall give to the young woman's father 50 shekels of silver, and she shall be his wife, because he has humbled her. He shall not be permitted to divorce her all of his days. Now, I took two sections there, but think, first of all, he says if it was on the countryside, and even if she screamed, there was no one there to help her, then the man dies, the woman doesn't. There were some benefits of living in the city, I guess. But he's saying also here, he says, look, if a man takes a woman, then he has sexual relations with her, then he's now obligated to marry her. And you're to care for her for the rest of her life. And no divorce isn't an option at this point. Heavy. Right? What's God establishing? He's establishing that this purity is something he took seriously. And once you've gone that far and you've, committed the act, then it was as though you were already married. And so God is saying you're going to be held accountable for that. So, God's establishing the importance of the family unit and the importance of the relationship, because that's what was going to build. And even to this day, guys, we think about this. Just for a second, think about this. When we see the breakdown of the family, it also means the breakdown of a culture. We see how many kids being raised and young men, young women raised without mom or a dad in the house, and how the impact that has upon their life. And then you look at how they begin to live their life. It's just this domino effect, and God is saying, look, the family unit has to be the foundation for the culture. Important. I can't remember the statistics. It's really high. 80-90% of our young men in our prisons come from a single family home with no dad. That's what it is. Because it's important that there's both to raise a family, right? And God is establishing things. Now think about this. This is Israel. And remember who's governing them? God. And he's wanting them to have a culture that has a foundation that's strong. And so he lays these things out for them. Now, verse 30, a man shall not take his father's wife nor uncover his father's bed. And just now the idea here is he has a stepmother, and we find that in 1 Corinthians. A man had his father's wife, and everyone was acting like it was okay, and Paul rebukes them, saying that that's wrong, right? And so he just here just laying out, look, even though that might not be your mother, it's your stepmother, and that's weird. Don't do it. That's all he's saying. Chapter 23. He who is emasculated by crushing or mutilation shall not enter the assembly of the Lord. Now, this would be, the eunuchs and those who were mutilated in that way. They said, man, they weren't allowed to come into the assembly. Now, verse 2, one of illegitimate birth shall not enter the assembly of the Lord, even to the 10th generation. None of the descendants shall enter the assembly of the Lord. An Ammonite or a Moabite shall not enter the assembly of the Lord, even to the 10th generation. None of the descendants shall enter the assembly of the Lord forever, because they did not meet you with bread and water on the road when you came out of Egypt, because they hired against you Balaam, the son of Beor, from Pethor of Mesopotamia, to curse you. Nevertheless, the Lord your God would not listen to Balaam, but the Lord your God turned the curse into a blessing for you, because the Lord your God, check this out, loves you. Guys, God is establishing the law because he loved his people. It wasn't because God's trying to be restrictive to them. It wasn't because God was trying to say, look, I got certain laws that have no meaning, but I'm going to give them to you anyway. That's not God's heart. God is going, I love you guys, and I'm trying to protect you. I'm trying to protect you. Now think about what has happened up until this point. God has already had to destroy the earth because of violence and immorality. He knows the consequence of man's wicked heart. And so God is establishing a protection for his people. And he goes, look, I'm doing all of these things because I love you. And those who cursed you, and he's talking, it's interesting, he's talking about those that had hired Balaam to curse the children of Israel. Remember Genesis chapter 12? We looked at it just on Sunday, I believe. Where he made a promise to Abraham, you leave your country, leave your people, and I'm going to go before you. And he says that I will bless those who bless you, and I'll curse those who curse you. And Abraham obeyed God, and God held his end of the bargain. Those who curse his people are cursed, and those who bless his people are blessed. And he says, these guys who cursed you, there's a consequence that's going to continue on them, because that's what God established. And so he tells them very clearly, look, these guys, there's a consequence. Verse 6, he says, you shall not seek their peace nor their prosperity all your days forever. And so there was a consequence to those who had done those things, the Moabites. And God was going to continue that. Now, verse 7, you shall not abhor an Edomite, for he is your brother. You shall not abhor an Egyptian, because you were an alien in his land. And now the Edomites were the descendants of Esau. Jacob and Esau were brothers, and Jacob is the one who became the father and of the tribes of Israel. And then Esau is the one who went to the other side of the Jordan. And God says, look, he's your brother. You're not going to hate him. You're not going to despise him, because you guys are still cousins. You're still brothers. And so God established that. The Egyptians, he said, you're not going to hate the Egyptians either, because you guys were saved by them when you guys were in a famine. And I put you there to protect you. So even though I wiped them out, you still got to love them. Now look at verse 9. When the army goes out against your enemies, keep yourself from every wicked thing. If there's any man among you who becomes unclean by some occurrence in the night, he shall go outside the camp. He shall not come into the camp, but it shall be when evening comes that he shall wash with water, and when the sun sets, he may come into the camp. Also, all you who have a place outside the camp where you may go out, you shall have an implement among your equipment, and when you sit down outside, you shall dig with it and turn and cover your refuse. For the Lord your God walks in the midst of your camp to deliver you and give your enemies over to you. Therefore your camp shall be holy, that he may see no unclean thing among you and turn away from you. Again, just interesting. When their refuse was to happen outside the camp, not in the camp. Now, you may think, well, that's good sanitary stuff. And I think I'm all for it. It's a good idea. Have the refuse outside the camp, and then it kept the smell, good in camp. But it's interesting. This has something to do with their religious life as well. He says, don't forget, God is walking amongst you guys. And the refuse was to be outside rather than the presence of God inside. Now, it's interesting that, God is talking about sanitary things and clean things. And it's just interesting that he's not only a holy God, but, God is establishing that there's things that defile. And so he's telling them, they keep clean. Now, 15, we got some different laws here. Just a couple of different things. We're wrapping it up. He says, you shall not give back to his master the slave who has escaped from his master to you. He may dwell with you in your midst in the place where he chooses within one of your gates, where he seems best to him. You shall not oppress him. Now, the law of a slave, if they came to you, you were to help them. There shall be no ritual harlots of the daughters of Israel, or a perverted one of the sons of Israel. You shall not bring the wages of a harlot or the price of a dog to the house of the Lord your God for any vowed offering, for both of these are an abomination to the Lord your God. And now, again, he's talking about the rituals of the prostitutes in the temples of the pagans. And part of the rituals was they would have prostitutes, and they would earn a wage. It was prostitution. I mean, it was what was going on inside their pagan temples. The males and the females. The males were called dogs. And so when the reference here doesn't mean the price of a dog is not like, Fido. He's not talking about Fido. He's talking about the price of the harlotry that would take place. And go think, we're just giving our money to the Lord. And don't bring that money to the Lord. That's an abomination to the Lord. It's so many. It's crazy how many in our mind we can go, I'm doing this illegally, but I'm gonna tithe on it anyway, and God will sanctify it. No, that's not. That's an abomination. You don't do something evil in order to go, I'm going to give it to God, so now it's blessed. That's not how it works. And he's wanted them to understand that that's not how it works. That, don't bring the wage of a prostitute into the house of the Lord and think that somehow that justifies it. Look at verse 19. You shall not charge interest to your brother, interest on money or food or anything that is lent out of at interest. To a foreigner you may charge interest, but to your brother you shall not charge interest, that the Lord your God may bless you in all which you set in your hand in the land which you are entering to possess. And so if it was a foreigner, you can charge him interest. If it was a brother, you weren't to charge him interest. And so God establishes that. Verse 21, when you make a vow to the Lord your God, you shall not delay to pay it. For the Lord your God will surely require it of you, and would be sin to you. If you abstain from vowing, it shall not be sin to you. That which is gone from your lips you shall keep and perform, for you voluntarily vow to the Lord your God what you have promised with your mouth. Now he's saying, look, if you make a vow to God, pay up. I remember, back when I wasn't serving the Lord. And I remember how many times I would want to bargain with God. God, if you do this, then I'll start serving you. And, I would make vows, and then God would actually answer that prayer, and then I would go back on my vow. I remember one time I thought I was going to die. I had overdosed on some drugs. And my heart was pounding out of my chest. I thought, man, I'm gonna go right now. And I remember crying out to God, God, if you just save me right now, I give, I'll serve you. I knew God had already been pursuing me. I knew God was already been trying to get my attention. And I remember as I'm crying out to the Lord, all of a sudden this peace came over me. My heart rate went down, and I just felt like, wow, God's presence was right there. And I was just like blown away, man. And I mean, for about 3 or 4 days, man, I'm just going to serve the Lord. And then there I go right back to my old life again. Getting high again. Doing drugs again. You know, and you're just like, man, how foolish it is to make a vow to God and then not pay up what you vowed. And so God is telling the children of Israel, if you know, what comes out of your mouth, you better be ready to pay up, man. Because you're a fool. Now, I love Ecclesiastes. Let me just turn there. Ecclesiastes chapter 5. The Ecclesiastes, Solomon given the accolades of being the wisest man in the world, right? Watch what Solomon says. Walk prudently when you go to the house of God. Draw near to hear rather than to give, and sacrifice of fools, for they do not know that they do evil. Do not be rash with your mouth, and let not your heart utter anything hastily before God. For God is in heaven and you're on earth. Therefore, let your words be few. For a dreamer comes through much activity, and a fool's voice is known by his many words. When you make a vow to God, do not delay to pay it, for God has no pleasure in fools. Pay what you have vowed. It's better not to vow than to vow and not to pay. Wow. If you make a vow to God, pay up. Because you're a fool if you don't. You're a fool. Because God hears you. And God's going to hold you to your vow. And so it just, you know, again, Deuteronomy, just telling, look, don't just rashly say things that you don't plan on following through with. If you're going to make a vow to God, you make a promise to God, you're going to make, you know, some vow. Make sure that you are going to hold up to your end of the bargain. And so he lays that out. Look at verse 24, and here it is. He says, and when you come into your neighbor's vineyard, you may eat your fill of grapes at your pleasure, but you shall not put any in your container. When you come into your neighbor's standing grain, you may pluck the heads with your hand, but you shall not use a sickle on your neighbor's standing grain. Just, you know, look, you're walking through, you see grapes, you're allowed to eat as many as you can while you're standing there, but don't start putting them in your backpack. Right? My neighbor's not home, man. You just take as many as I can. You know, now you're walking around with trash bags down the street, and then, you know, they're in Hawaii. I'm going to go to their field, and you start cutting down all their wheat. That's wrong. And so he just tells them very, you know, make sure that, you know, if you're hungry, you're welcome to eat what you can eat while you're standing there, but don't start taking it so you can feed the whole neighborhood. So many practical things that God is instructing the children of Israel. Now, next week, chapter 24, he's going to talk about divorce, and then he's, you know, a lot more of the laws that he's establishing, you know, the duty of marriage, and to a brother, if a brother died. I mean, just so many of these things that the children of Israel. And guys, here's the cool thing. As you're going through the rest of Scripture, there's references to these laws that we're looking at today. And so it gives you the ability to go, oh, that's what they mean by that. That's what, and you're building, what are you building? You're building the ability to understand the heart of God and the Word of God. I think so many times we take these books and we just kind of, you know, go through them, or I'll skip those, or, you know, those aren't really valid or important. They're very important, because you're establishing a theology. You're establishing an understanding of God when we're going through these Old Testament books. Because now, when you're reading the rest of Scripture, it now becomes pertinent. I mean, think about what Jesus is dealing with that woman who was caught in adultery. Right? You don't understand the Old Testament. How do you know, well, what does that all mean? You know now. We just went through Deuteronomy 22, 23, and now you have established for you, look, man, that's what the law said, but look what Jesus said. And so it gives us that foundation for our spiritual life so that we can grow in the knowledge of him. Father,